Jens, you're very welcome to start.
Thanks so much. Just had to unmute myself there. And thanks so much for the invitation to give this talk. It's really a pleasure. And I'm so already kind of fascinated by the idea that I will talk and then we'll discuss and then we'll have a break and then we'll continue discussing. That's really amazing with that level of engagement. So I'll share some slides and then I'll get going with my talk. So can you see the slides now in presentation mode? Seems to work. Good. And you can also hear me okay? Yeah, it also works. Excellent. Good. So I was approached by Linda Engström about this talk, and initially I was a little bit, I'm working a little bit on issues around land and climate, but Linda asked me to kind of, can you say something about, maybe put your work into a broader context of land rights? And then I was like, ooh, I'm not sure I can do that. But I've been thinking a little bit about some of these questions as I prepared. So I'll try maybe and give some hints as to my thoughts in that direction. But most of what I'm going to be talking about is going to be focusing on this question around the role of land in climate mitigation, and in particular, actually focusing on the role of land in what we call carbon removal. So carbon removal, this idea of removing CO2 from the atmosphere actively. And before I get going too far, I want to start with some acknowledgements and just pointing to some of the things that I will be drawing on in the presentation. So I'll start there, and I'll see if I can get my slides to change. There we go. So these are three people who I've had the pleasure of working with over the recent 4 to 5 years. It's Wim Carden from Lund University, Kate Dooley from Melbourne, and Christine Lund Christiansen here in Copenhagen with me. And we had a project together, and as part of that project, Kate suggested this idea of trying to understand what are actually the land implications of countries' current ideas for carbon removal, and that resulted in what some of you might know as the Land Gap report that came out first time in 2022. And I'll talk more about that because on the back of that we wrote a paper. But just to say that Kate, but also Wim and Christina, of course, have been completely instrumental to my own understanding and work on these questions. And maybe in particular, Kate, many of you might know her. Really an incredibly resourceful person who has been part of the thinking on the implications of climate mitigation for land for a couple of decades now, and who is deeply knowledgeable about these questions as they relate to the UNFCCC negotiations and process. And here are just a couple of the papers that we've had the chance to write together. And then the second group of people I've worked with, you will see that Wim from Lund is still there. And this was a part of another project where we focused not so much on land necessarily, but more on this question of carbon removal. So taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and interrogated this question of whether that idea also maybe leads to a delay in the effort to reduce emissions. And this was together with Wim, but also Holly Jean Bock from Buffalo in the US, who's also written a fantastic book about geoengineering, Nils Markusson, who has been part of the debate about CCS technology, this approach to reduce CO2 from the smokestack for a decade and a half, who's at Lancaster, and then Inge Merete Hougaard, who's an anthropologist here from University of Copenhagen also. So we were interested in these two questions. Does carbon removal lead to a delay in the effort to reduce emissions? Something that I'll come back to. And the second part of our work concerned this other question around carbon removal. Why do we even need it? We need it because there is this idea that we will never be able to mitigate, to reduce emissions to zero. So there will also be something that will always be something we call residual emissions. And to be able to reach net zero, residual emissions must be neutralized by carbon removal. So we were also interested in understanding, so how do countries and companies and other actors delimit what is it possible to mitigate and thereby create a demand for carbon removal? And I'll also come back to that question a little bit in my talk and how it all of this relates to the question of land, I think. So why am I so interested in carbon removal? I'm interested in it because I've, some years back started getting interested in climate mitigation and then realized that much of the climate mitigation effort hinges on this idea that we will be able to remove quite large amounts of carbon dioxide removal, large amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in the coming decades. Because most of the scenarios, and now I just represent the 1.5 scenarios that we have, climate scenarios, they rely on what we call overshoot, in the sense that we will blow the carbon budget corresponding to that temperature threshold, and then we will need carbon removal not only to neutralize residual emissions at the point of net zero, but actually also to create what's called net negative emissions at the global level, where we take more CO2 out of the atmosphere than what we emit, to bring the temperature down from this overshoot towards the end of the 21st century. And all this adds up, and it adds up to different levels depending on how much we delay emissions reductions in the present moment. And the kind of many scenarios that respect the 1.5 degree threshold at the end of the century require between, as you can see in the third bullet point here, 30 up towards more than 1,000 gigatons of CO2 removed by not only land use sector removals, but more technologically mediated removals, such as direct air capture with CCS, and a further around 20 to 400 gigatons from the land use sector. So it's very large amounts, given that the gross emissions is around 60 gigatons per year at the present, before we count the land and ocean sinks. So I think it's interesting because it sets out a demand on the present, but in particular a demand on the future. This idea that in the future we will be able to remove large amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere again as a means to reach the Paris Agreement, or to respect the Paris Agreement temperature thresholds. And scale matters here. This is just a graphic illustration of what I was just saying, right? We have many different scenarios. All of them respect the 1.5 degree threshold. This is a bit dated. It's the 1.5 degree report produced by IPCC in 2018. And it just shows the kind of trade-off between immediate emissions reductions, which are the more blue with limited overshoot, where we can rely mainly on land-based removal towards the end of the century to meet the temperature threshold, and a high overshoot, the more gray scenarios, where we delay reductions in emissions further, and where we end up needing very large amounts of net negative emissions towards the end of the century to meet the temperature thresholds, in this case 1.5 degree. And I just highlighted minus 20 gigaton here, the so-called P4 scenario, where we will have minus 20 towards the end of the century, because that is roughly, I guess, what the global land and ocean sink is, what they're doing for us right now in the present, right? So we have to imagine that we, through afforestation, through regenerative agricultural approaches, through technologically mediated carbon removal, create another biospheres worth of drawdown of sink towards the end of the century. So it's enormous amounts we're talking about if we are looking at those kind of magnitudes. So this is something that has been known for a while within the kind of, you could say, global climate modeling community, but also people who have been, concerned and critical of the ways in which models create futures that seem rather unrealistic and far-fetched from the vantage point of the present. So what we were interested in understanding in these two projects was, among other, is this, are these kind of ideas in the models, do they actually influence policy? Are they borne out in reality? Or is this just, modelers' wild ideas that never actually make it out of the IPCC reports and into what we can call reality? So this is some results from one of the studies that I was lucky to do with these great people over the past few years, where we started looking into these climate policies of different countries. So in this study, we were particularly interested in understanding this question around residual emissions, which is part of what gives rise to the need for carbon removal. So we were interested in understanding at the point of net zero in countries' long-term climate plans, how many emissions are left. So at the point of net zero, we must have a balance between emissions and removals per definition, right? So if there are any emissions left, residual, we will need a corresponding amount of carbon removal. So it was a way to try and understand what is the needed amounts of carbon removal according to the climate plans that countries submit to the UNFCCC. And we saw in that countries project. So I should say that this was, you can find the paper, of course, if you're interested later on, that not all countries, far from all countries, give that information in the present. So it's a small subset of countries that actually have that information available in their long-term climate plans at the moment. But for the countries that we were able to find estimates, we said that if all countries, if the rest of the countries in the world do like this small subset of countries, follow the same path, basically in terms of the share of residuals in their current emissions, then we might look at around 12.4 gigatons of carbon removal by the year 2050. So that actually bears out the kind of the wilder scenarios that I was just presenting, right? 12.5 gigatons, that put us on this kind of scenario path that leads to around a need for around 20 gigatons by the end of the century. So this is concerning, right? Because that means that countries are betting on removal as opposed to maybe being more ambitious on emissions reductions, not only in the present, but also in the kind of longer term plans towards 2050. Much of the residual emissions in here are what is called hard to abate sectors. So there's some international transport for those countries that count that. It was mainly the UK, I think. But it's very much agriculture, but also heavy industry for some countries. Interestingly, there's also variation in what countries consider possible to abate and not. And that is, of course, a variation that is politically and also from a research perspective interesting. Is there any way in which we can use that variation to push countries to become more ambitious if their neighboring country can reduce the same types of emissions? So this was just to say that there is reason for concern in terms of the overall picture of failure to mitigate effectively, which creates this demand for large-scale carbon removal also in countries' policies. So not only in these models that and scenarios that have been criticized for quite a while. So how can we then remove CO2 from the atmosphere? What kind of tools do we have at our to available? And this is just super brief. I'm not going to go into that, but just to say that there's of course many ways in which this is being imagined. Some of them are more land-based, biologically, directly, you could say, facilitated by biological processes. Some are more geochemical or chemical in nature, using, for instance, this direct air capture that I was talking about. And also in terms of how do we then make sure that the CO2 stays out of the atmosphere, there's of course differences. The more land-based, that's where we will maybe imagine that we will store the carbon in trees or in soils, but we can of course also use bioenergy and then connect it to what's called carbon capture and storage facility and send it down into the subsurface where it can over time connect through chemical processes with minerals and become mineralized and thereby securely deposited. But this varies, of course, in terms of different types of geological formations, whether that's possible and how long it takes, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think I'll say much more about that, but that's just to say this is, I think, the picture that many of these modelers are also thinking about when they, think about the possibilities here. But if we then look at, and maybe also what policymakers are thinking about, if we look at how this unfolds in the present, how removals are created right now, there's a very good research group that I can recommend people who are interested in this to look out to. They produce a report every year called The State of Carbon Dioxide Removal, where they, among other, try to estimate so how much removal is actually being generated at the moment and how. And what this figure shows is that the amount of removal presently is only around 2 gigatons per year. So 1/6 of what we might need in 2050 and going further, according to what countries are setting out, not according to what I think we need. But what more importantly here is maybe that almost all of this is from what they call conventional CDR, and that is land-based. So mainly afforestation and reforestation processes. So the present picture of removal is predominantly focused or predominantly carried by the land sector. And I think that's important to keep in mind that many of the other ideas for how we can generate carbon removal are mainly ideas more than practices. Of course, there are test sites and there are functioning facilities with direct air capture, but it's a handful, right? And they generate very, very small amounts of removal. And then having looked at this, then the next question, of course, becomes so not only what are countries' plans in terms of carbon removal, maybe, but what are countries' plans in terms of the role of land in generating carbon removal? And that was the question pitched by Kate Dooley, and the question that I was lucky to be part of trying to answer in this process that led to what we called the land gap report. So just to say again, in the acknowledgements, I only mentioned a few people, but this particular report that came out in 2022 before the COP drew on a much wider collaboration. So there was a bunch of organizations that came in and co-funded it, and there was also a bunch of academics who volunteered their time to be part of contributing to this. And it's an effort that is ongoing into the present. So if you're interested in some of the stuff that I'm talking about, this is really a good place to go and to keep being updated. But the framing here was that is there basically a gap between what governments are expecting in terms of land-based carbon removal and the role that land can realistically play, given that we will also want to have land available for food production, biodiversity, and all these other things. So that was basically the idea, that we wanted to try and understand this. And again, we went back to countries' climate pledges, both these long-term low emissions development strategies that typically set out the trajectory for the country's climate efforts towards the point of net zero, but also the shorter term NDCs. So both of these reports are submitted to the UNFCCC. And so we went through these reports, all of the reports that are available at the UNFCCC homepage, and then we looked for carbon removal pledges. And they took different forms, of course. Some were pledged directly as megatons of CO2 that the country said in 2030 we will remove 5 megatons of CO2, for instance, every year from the atmosphere, or indirectly as land use change. So we will afforest X million hectares towards 2050, or directly as an area pledge. So indirectly as change in land use, that would be a percentage, sorry, or directly as hectares. And then for those that were directly as land area, it was quite easy, right? Because we could just say, okay, this country will use so many hectares of land. But those that were for megaton or land use change, we used IPCC removal factors to convert pledges in CO2 or in other things into an area pledge, to move from different types of pledges and into an estimate of the land area we required. And you can just see an overview here in this table, but I'll give some more summary results that are maybe easier to interpret. So first result that came out of this is that these pledges, the country's pledges, set out what I think we can say is a very high demand for land, on land for removal. Towards 2060, which was the year of the pledge that was furthest out into the future, the total land area needed for this purpose, right, of removing CO2 from the atmosphere, according to country's own plans is around 1 billion hectares. So that is roughly much more than the size of the US. And maybe maybe more concerning is that, or as concerning at least, is that more than 400 million hectares of that involves an active land use change. So typically it would be reforestation, right? So imagine a piece of land used for agriculture or pastoralism or something else converted into forest. And of course, that is likely to put a lot of pressure, right, on ecosystems and indigenous people's land rights, et cetera, et cetera. And I should also hurry up and say that this is clearly a lower limit estimate of what countries are, the country's reliance in policies, because there was around 50 countries for which we could not quantify this CDR, right? So this is not an estimate where we have extrapolated what we found. This is the direct estimate. We haven't counted anything from countries where there was no information. We set it to 0. And some of those countries are, in my view, maybe likely to actually have plans for using land for CDR. There's countries such as Argentina, the Central African Republic, Peru, Malaysia, and the Philippines. So quite big forested countries are not part of the sample here. The second kind of result that I want to zoom in on here is that the rate of implementation is quite remarkable. This is showing the line here showing the development in the cumulative area that is being managed in a new way for carbon removal over time. And if we just zoom in on the pledges, the 400 million hectare pledges that required a land use change, the change in land use per year, approximately from 2020 until 2050, you will see there's only one pledge after 2050. So if we take the period 2020 to 2050, it's around 13 million hectares per year on average. For comparison, the land rush that we were concerned about back around the food crisis around 27-8, and that was monitored quite intensively since then. If we look at the kind of most intensive period of that, around 27 towards 2014, it was around 7 million hectares that was estimated as being transacted per year. So this is twice that amount just for carbon removal, right? This doesn't include many other things where land management would be changing. Yeah. So who is driving this? Who are imagining to restructure land management at a very large scale? This is the total area that is enrolled for carbon removal divided upon countries. So we can see it's a small group of countries that are really driving this, right? It's Russia, Saudi Arabia, the US, Canada, together comprise around 70%, right? So that is, of course, also important to bear in mind that let's say these countries, let's say Russia and Saudi Arabia got their numbers completely wrong. The picture could be completely different, right? And of course, this may not become real world developments. But of course, it's also worth keeping in mind that many of the countries that take up a lot of space in the total here are large fossil fuel producers, coal, but also other fossil fuels, right? So we have India, China, part of this small sample, Australia. Yeah, so many of them, as you can see, are quite big fossil producers, which could also maybe talk into this notion that maybe there's also a little bit of what we can call mitigation deterrence going on here, that maybe pushing the burden onto land instead of reducing your own fossil fuel production could be going on. If we look a little bit different at the numbers and say, so as a part of the national territory, how much land is being set aside across countries for this purpose? It's a kind of a different way of looking at the picture. We can see that some countries like Dominica and Equatorial Guinea set aside more area than the national territory. It could be a mistake, might very well be a mistake. It could also be an idea of wanting to engage on the carbon market, maybe unlikely. Saudi Arabia, the third on the list, sets aside 93% of its territory for reforestation. We know that that is an idea of engaging on the international carbon market under Article 6 as a way of fulfilling pledges. But we can also see a number of poorer countries in here that will set aside quite large share of the national territories for this purpose. And that, of course, can fuel these fears of, you know, a renewed green grab and carbon colonialism, facilitated by the possibility now under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement to trade trade carbon credits as a way of fulfilling the mitigation obligations under the Paris Agreement. So the conclusions of this study, this land gap study, is that a few high income and high emitting countries are driving this result, this massive need for land for CDR, and that the rates of land use change indicated by these pledges is quite unprecedented, I think, and that there are some risks involved in that. Also, I think it's remarkable that, or interesting to pay attention to how poorer countries are setting aside a large share of their territories, indicative of this fear of a green grab that we have been talking about. And then more kind of what do we want policymakers who work with these policies to do? Want much more assumptions to be made explicit. I mean, where is all this CDR going to happen and how, right? I mean, these pledges are there's very little, very sparse information on that. And then we also suggest that it will maybe be a good idea to have separate targets for reductions and land-based removals versus more permanent removals, also to kind of create clarity around what are the expectations for countries going forward. So now I will remove myself from this world of policies, because we started in models and we clearly saw some big expectations of CDR and land in those, and then we moved to policies. But what is then happening, let's say in the real world? And so we have now the Article 6 in place, and even before that happened, I mean, Article 6 allowing for the trading of mitigation results across countries that can then be used to fulfill the pledges made under the Paris Agreement. And already before that, we saw some countries already starting to move. So Switzerland already in 2020 made an agreement with the country of Peru about implementing mitigation activities under the expected rules governing this Article 6. And Switzerland has for decades been really active in this space of flexibility mechanisms, as they're also called. But I think maybe more interesting is a new development, a new player, relatively new, the UAE, United Arab Emirates-based company that's called Blue Carbon, that has made a handful of massive deals with African countries. So Zimbabwe has made a deal for around 20% of its territory. Tanzania, Zambia, Liberia have also made similar deals, and these deals completely correspond, right, in many ways to the numbers that we saw in these policies. And what will happen as a consequence of these deals is, of course, completely uncertain. But at least we can see that fears from models have kind of flowed into policies and maybe also into actual practices. So where does all this leave people who are concerned about both climate and land rights? I mean, as I said, we don't know whether any of this that is happening now in models and policies, but also in these deals struck between different countries, is going to materialize, right? If it does materialize, then I think it is very clear that people concerned about land rights and vulnerable people who are land dependent really need to be ready, because as I said, the scale and speed with which this should unfold is quite dramatic. But there's of course also the risk that it doesn't unfold, that it doesn't happen, right? That it stays in contracts and whatnot, and then yeah, the risks are almost as grave, right? Because if the total sum of NDCs does not bring us down towards the 2-degree temperature threshold yet, embedded in those NDCs are these land developments, right? So that means that there's another layer of insufficiency in climate plans, that if those plans are not don't materialize, then we are even further from the mitigation hoped for mitigation results. And if that happens, of course, then some of the same people who would be facing a green grab are then facing another threat, right? Many of the same people will be hurt most by the unfolding climate crisis. So I'm not. So this was kind of the results, and then I'm thinking, so what could we then, what are the kind of things that maybe we could be doing? And sorry for just pushing my own work out there again, but I think one of the things that is worth doing again, because many people have been doing it, is to kind of bringing back history to the debate about carbon removal, right? Because we see still these kind of wild ideas about what is possible with carbon removal on land, and also and many of those ideas, I think, fail to recognize that we know quite a lot about the interventions that comprise land-based carbon removal, right? We're talking about REDD+, forestry, conservation, tree planting, and there's a whole history of research that is rarely recognized in that debate. So I think bringing that back to the conversation is, of course, an important task. From Eva Löfbrand on the struggle over the inclusion of LULUCF into the Kyoto Protocol, where some of all this started, right? The kind of carbon accounting logic that made all of these ideas of using land as a way of mitigating possible in the first place, to Sarah Milne and colleagues, done fantastic work to summarize what have we learned from REDD+ and the kind of massive failures of the scheme. And I can see Sarah is here with us, right? So thanks for that, Sarah. Of course, also people at the STEPS Center, Melissa Leach, Ian Schoons, James Fairhead, also following the development of carbon forestry, Forrest Fleischmann, Harry Fisher, who's also based here in Sweden. Great work on the kind of limited effects of these large-scale tree planting efforts over decades in India, and also Flora Haidu and others also based here in Scandinavia. And there's so many more, right? But I think that work is so important to put that into the carbon removal discussion, because I think many of the people who are excited about carbon removal maybe still are not really paying attention to what we do know already. And then I think also more kind of studies on the kind of agrarian implications of climate scenarios. I think here that the work done, I think a couple of years back by Yevgeny Blufstein and Connor Kavanagh really stands out. Really an impressive piece of work. Others might have done more on this. I haven't paid enough attention, but I think this is really a great study, trying to understand, pick apart these scenarios and see what do they actually imply for different regions in the world. There's also a research group in India more lately that has done some really good work on this, on the kind of inequalities, geographic inequalities baked into climate scenarios. The Kanitkar and the group around her. But just to kind of briefly show some of the things that come out in this paper is, of course, these different shared socioeconomic scenarios, the consequences that they have for rural populations across the globe. And this is just a very, rough characterization between, broadly speaking, the global north and global south. But we see these scenarios foresee like a dramatic drop in the rural population in the global south. And that is, of course, part of what makes space for all these wild ideas about using huge territories for mitigation. Another kind of Another illustration is what are the kind of rates of change in land use across different parts of the world. Again, here, global north, global south, where we can see that forests are expected to grow back on a dramatic scale in the global south, corresponding to the picture that we saw, but where there will be a loss of pasture and cropland as compared to the global north. So I think some of these results that they presented so well in this study, I think more could be done to try and unpack at more detailed level what are the kind of ideas floating around there that influence policy, and what are the kind of embedded assumptions that need to come out much more clearly in the policy discussion. And then finally, I think because there has been a lot of critique of models already, but I think it's very interesting to see some scholars are now really trying to engage modelers in much more, you could say, intimate encounters, trying to change the way that modelers think about their own assumptions. I think it's really inspiring work. This is a study where the scholar facilitated meetings between artists and modelers, which created a whole new atmosphere around the discussion of central assumptions in models, some of the ones I just showed you, in an atmosphere that was maybe less threatening than a scientific conference, where it was possible to discuss more openly these things and maybe at least create the possibility for change. And I think that kind of work is quite important, because some of this is legitimated still by these models, right? I think it does an important function. So I think that is worth working on. And then finally, keep up the collective efforts. And some of the places where I have been part of really nice collective efforts to try and push back on some of these developments have been through what's called the Climate Social Science Network, which is an interesting global community of climate social scientists that also includes modelers, and where you can have some of these discussions where people who work from a more, let's call it broadly, political ecology perspective can actually have real discussions in, online meetings with modelers and try to influence across these different spheres. The researcher's desk, also Swedish-based, you do so much great work across Öresund, so thanks for that. Has been very helpful in organizing collective efforts to write in the press about some of these issues around offsetting, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, the Political Ecology Network, which is a fantastic place with so many people who do really, really important work from the ground up, illustrating the consequences of some of these ideas and developments. So I will just urge everyone to keep an eye out for these three collectives if you're interested in working more on these kind of things. With that, thank you a lot for listening patiently and quietly, and then I guess it's time for some questions.